Hi, second graders. So I feel like it's time for us to read our next chapter of the BFG. We are very close to being finished. I think we have 4 chapters left. 4 left. We're almost done. So this chapter is called The Royal Breakfast. So make sure before you listen to this one, you've listened to the last 3 chapters, because if you haven't listened to the last 3 chapters, you're not going to know what's going on. So just a quick review. The BFG and Sophie have reached the Queen's Palace and they have talked to the Queen of England, and she has invited them in for breakfast. So let's see what happens next. There was a frantic scurry among the palace servants when orders were received from the Queen that a 24-foot giant must be served with Her Majesty in the great ballroom within the next half hour. The butler, an imposing personage named Mr. Tibbs, was in supreme command of all the palace servants, and he did the best he could in the short of time available. A man does not rise to become the Queen's butler unless he is gifted with extraordinary ingenuity, adaptability, dexterity, cunning, sophistication, indiscretion, and a host of other talents that neither you nor I possess. Mr. Tibbs had them all. He was in the butler's pantry sipping an early morning glass of light ale when the order reached him. In a split second, he had made the following calculations in his head. If a normal 6-foot man requires a 3-foot high table to eat off of, a 24-foot giant will require a 24-foot high table. Will require a 12-foot high table. And if a 6-foot man requires a chair with a 2-foot high seat, a 24-foot giant will require a chair with an 8-foot high seat. Everything, Mr. Tibbs told himself, must be multiplied by 4. 2 breakfast eggs must become 8. 4 rations of bacon must become 16, and 3 pieces of toast must become 12, and so on. These calculations about food were immediately passed on to the Monsieur Papillon, the royal chef. Mr. Tibbs skimmed into the ballroom. Butlers don't walk, they skim over the ground, followed by a whole army of footmen. The footmen all wore knee breeches, and every one of them displayed beautifully rounded calves and ankles. There is no way you can become a royal footman unless you have well-turned ankles. It is the first thing they look at when you are interviewed. "Push the grand piano into the center of the room," Mr. Tibbs whispered. Butlers never raised their voice above the softest whisper. 4 footmen moved the piano. "Now, fetch a large chest of drawers and put it on the top of the piano," Mr. Tibbs whispered. 3 other footmen fetched a very fine Chippendale mahogany chest of drawers and placed it on top of the piano. "That will be his chair," Mr. Tibbs whispered. "It is an excellent 8 feet off the ground. Now, we shall make a table upon which this gentleman may eat his breakfast in comfort. Fetch me 4 very tall grandfather clocks. There are plenty of them around the palace. Let each clock be 12 feet high." 16 footmen spread out all over the palace to find the clocks. They were not easy to carry and required 4 footmen for each. "Place the 4 clocks in a rectangle 8 feet by 4 alongside the grand piano," Mr. Tibbs whispered. The footman did so. "Now fetch me the young prince ping-pong table," Mr. Tibbs whispered. The ping-pong table was carried in. "Unscrew its leg and take them away," Mr. Tibbs whispered, and this was done. "Now place the ping-pong table atop of the 4 grandfather clocks," Mr. Tibbs whispered. To manage this, the footmen had to stand on step ladders. Mr. Tibbs stood back and surveyed the new furniture. "None of this is in the classic style," he whispered, "but it will have to do," and he gave orders that a damask tablecloth should be draped over the ping-pong table, and in the end, it looked quite elegant after all. Here are the footmen carrying the grandfather clocks. At this point, Mr. Tibbs was seen to hesitate. The footmen all stared at him, aghast. Butlers never hesitate, not even when they are faced with the most impossible problems. It is their job to be totally decisive at all times. "Knives and forks and spoons," Mr. Tibbs was heard to mutter. "Our cutlery will be like little pins in his hands." But Mr. Tibbs didn't hesitate for long. "Tell the head gardener," he whispered, "that I require immediately a brand new unused garden fork and also a spade." And for a knife we shall use the great sword hanging on the wall in the morning room. But clean the sword first very well. It was last used to cut off the head of King Charles in the first, and there may still be a little bit of dried blood on the blade." When all of this had been accomplished, Mr. Tibbs stood near the center of the ballroom, casting his expert butler eye over the scene. Had he forgotten anything? He certainly had. What about a coffee cup for the large gentleman? "Fetch me," he whispered, "the biggest jug you can find in the kitchen." And a splendid 1-gallon porcelain water jug was brought in and placed on the giant's table beside the garden fork and the garden spade and the great sword. So much for the giant. Mr. Tibbs had the footman move all the small, delicate tables and 2 chairs alongside the giant's table. This was for the queen and for Sophie, and the fact that the giant's table and chair towered above the smaller table could simply not be helped. All these arrangements were only just completed when the queen, now fully dressed in a trim skirt and a cashmere cardigan, entered the ballroom holding Sophie by the hand. A pretty blue dress that had once belonged to one of the princesses had been found for Sophie, and to make her look prettier still, the queen had picked up a superb sapphire brooch from her dressing table and had pinned it to the left side of Sophie's chest. The big friendly giant followed behind them, but he had an awful job getting through the door. He had to squeeze himself through on his hands and knees, with 2 footmen pushing him from behind and 2 pulling him from the front. But he got through in the end. He had removed his black coat and got rid of his trumpet and was now wearing his ordinary simple clothes. As he walked across the ballroom, he had to stoop quite a lot to avoid hitting the ceiling. Because of this, he failed to notice an enormous chandelier. Crash went his head right into the chandelier, and a shower of glass fell upon the poor BFG. "Gong hammers and bogswinkles," he cried. "What was that?" And there he is, running into the chandelier. And there in the corner you can see Sophie and the queen. "It was Louis XV, the queen said, looking slightly put out. "He's never been in the house before," Sophie said. Mr. Tibbs scowled. He directed 4 footmen to clean up the mess, and then, with a disdainful little wave of the hand, he indicated to the giant that he should seat himself on top of the chest of drawers and on the top of the grand piano. "What a fizz-whizzing, flunk-bunking seat!" cried the BFG. "I is going to be a bug as a snug in a rug up here." "Does he always speak like that?" the queen asked. "Quite often," Sophie said. "He gets tangled up with his words." The BFG sat down on the chest of drawers piano and gazed in wonder around the great ballroom. "By gumdrops," he cried, "what a spiffling whoopsie room we is in! It is so gigantuous. I is needing binoculars and telescopes to see what is going on at the other end." The footman arrived carrying silver trays with fried eggs, bacon, sausages, and fried potatoes. At this point, Mr. Tibbs suddenly realized that in order to serve the BFG at his 12-foot-high grandfather clock table, he would have to climb up to the top of the tall step ladders. What's more, he must do it balancing a huge warm plate on the palm of one hand and holding a gigantic silver coffee pot in the other. A normal man would have flinched at the thought of it, but good butlers never flinch. Up he went, up and up and up and up, while the queen and Sophie watched him with great interest. It is possible that they were both secretly hoping he would lose his balance and go crashing to the floor, but good butlers never crash. At the top of the ladder, Mr. Tibbs, balancing like an acrobat, poured the BFG's coffee and placed the enormous plate before him. On the plate there were 8 eggs, 12 sausages, 16 rashers of bacon, and a heap of fried potatoes. "What is this, please, your majesty?" the BFG asked, peering down at the queen. "He's never eaten anything but snozzcumbers," said Sophie. So here we have the queen and Sophie sitting at their small table, and the BFG sitting at his very large table. "They taste revolting," Sophie said about the snozzcumbers. "They don't seem to have stunted his growth," the queen said. The BFG grabbed the garden spade and scooped up all the eggs, sausages, bacons, and potatoes in one go and shoveled them into his enormous mouth.
By goggles, he cried. This stuff is making snozcumpers taste like swatchwallop.
The Queen glanced up, frowning. Mr. Tibbs looks down at his toes and moves his lips in silent prayer.
That was only one titchy little bite, the BFG says. Is you having any more of this delicious grubble in your cupboard, Majesty?
Tibbs, the Queen said, showing true royal hospitality. Fetch the gentleman another dozen fried eggs and a dozen sausages. Mr. Tibbs swam out of the room, muttering unspeakable words to himself and wiping his brow with a white handkerchief. The BFG lifted a huge jug and took a swallow.
Ouch, he cried, blowing a mouthful across the ballroom. Please, what is this horrible swig spill I is drinking, Magister?
It's coffee, the Queen told him. Freshly roasted.
It's filthum, the BFG cried out. Where is the frobscottle?
The what? The Queen asked.
Delicious, fizzy frobscottle, the BFG answered. Everyone must be drinking frobscottle with breakfast, Magister. Then we can all be whoopsing happily together afterwards.
What does he mean? The Queen said, frowning at Sophie. What is whiz-popping? Sophie kept a very straight face. BFG, she said. There is no frobscottle here and whiz-popping is strictly forbidden.
What?
Cried the BFG.
No frobscottle? No whiz-popping? No glumtious music? No boom, boom, boom?
Absolutely not, Sophie told him firmly. If he wants to sing, please don't stop him, the Queen said. He doesn't want to sing, Sophie said. He said he wants to make music, the Queen went on. Shall I fetch him a violin? No, Your Majesty, Sophie said. He's only joking. A shy little smile crossed the BFG's face.
Listen, he said, peering down at Sophie. If they isn't having any frobscottle here in the palace, I can still go whiz-popping perfectly well without any eyes trying hard enough.
No, cried Sophie. No, you can't, I beg you. Music is very good for the digestion, the Queen said. When I'm up in Scotland, they play bagpipes outside the window while I'm eating. Do play something.
I has Her Majesty's permission, cried the BFG, and all at once he let fly with a whiz-popper that sounded as though a bomb had exploded in the room. Does everybody remember what a whiz-popper is? The Queen jumped. Whoopee! Shouted the BFG. This is better than bagpipes, is it not, Magister? It took the Queen a few seconds to get over the shock. I prefer the bagpipes, she said, but she couldn't stop herself from smiling. During the next 20 minutes, a whole relay of footmen were kept busy hurrying to and from the kitchen, carrying third and fourth helpings and fifth helpings of fried eggs and sausages for the ravenous and delighted BFG. When the BFG had consumed his 72nd fried egg, Mr. Tibbs slid up to the Queen. He bent low from the waist and whispered in her ear, The chef sends his apologies, Your Majesty. He says he has no more eggs in the kitchen. What's wrong with the hens? The Queen said. Nothing's wrong with the hens, Your Majesty, Mr. Tibbs whispered. Then tell them to lay more, the Queen said. She looked up at the BFG. Have some toast and marmalade while you're waiting, she said to him. The toast is finished, Mr. Tibbs whispered, and chef says there's no more bread. Tell him to bake more, the Queen said. While all this was going on, Sophie had been telling the Queen everything, absolutely everything about her visit in Giant Country. The Queen listened appalled, and when Sophie had finished, the Queen looked up at the BFG who was sitting high above her. He was now eating a sponge cake. Big friendly giant, she said. Last night, those man-eating brutes came to England, and can you remember where they were the night before? The BFG put a whole round sponge cake into his mouth and chewed it slowly while he thought about this question. Yes, Magister, he said. I do think I is remembering where they was going the night before last. They was galloping off to Sweden for the sweet and sour taste. Fetch me a telephone, the Queen commanded, and Mr. Tibbs placed the instrument on the table. The Queen lifted the receiver. Get me the King of Sweden, she said. Good morning, the Queen said. Is everything all right in Sweden? Everything is terrible, the Queen of Sweden answered. There is panic in the capital. 2 nights ago, 26 of my loyal subjects disappeared. My whole country is in panic. Your 26 loyal subjects were all eaten by giants, the queen said. Apparently, they like the taste of Swedes. Why do they like the taste of Swedes? The king asked. Because the Swedes of Sweden have a sweet and sour taste. So says the BFG, said the queen. I don't know what you're talking about, the queen said, growing testy. It's hardly a joking matter when one loyal subjects are being eaten like popcorn. They've eaten mine as well, the queen said. Who's they, for heaven's sakes? Asked the king. Giants, the queen said. Look here, said the king. Are you feeling all right? It's been a rough morning, the queen said. First, I had a horrible nightmare. Then, the maid dropped my breakfast, and now I've got a giant on a piano. You need a doctor, quick, cried the king. I'll be all right, the queen said. I must go now. Thanks for your help. And she replaced the receiver. Your BFG is right, the queen said to Sophie. Those 90 man-eating brutes did go to Sweden. It's horrible, Sophie said. Please stop them, your majesty. I'd like to make one more check before I call out the troops, Sophie said, and once more she looked up at the BFG, and he was eating donuts now, popping them into his mouth 10 at a time, like peas. Think hard, BFG, she said. Where did those horrid giants say they were going off 3 nights ago? The BFG thought long and hard. Ho, ho, he cried at last. Yes, I was remembering. Where? One was off to Baghdad, the BFG said. As they is galloping past my cave, Flesh Lump Eater is waving his arms and shouting at me, I is off to Baghdad, I is off to Baghdad, and Mom and every one of their 10 children as well. And once more the queen lifted the receiver. Give me the Lord Mayor of Baghdad, she said, and if they don't have a Lord Mayor, give me the next best thing. In 5 seconds, the voice was on the line. Here is the Sultan of Baghdad speaking, the voice said. Listen, Sultan, the queen said. Did anything unpleasant happen in your city 3 nights ago? Every night is unpleasant. Things are happening in Baghdad, the Sultan said. We are chopping off people's heads like you are chopping parsley. I was never chopping parsley in my life, the queen said. I don't know if anyone has disappeared recently, and I want to know if anyone has disappeared recently in Baghdad. Only my uncle, said the Sultan. He disappeared from his bed 3 nights ago, together with his wife and 10 children. There you is, cried the BFG, whose wonderful ears enabled him to hear what the Sultan was saying on the other end of the telephone. Flesh Lump Eater did that one. He went off to Baghdad and Mom and all the little kitties. The queen replaced the receiver. That proves it, she said, looking up at the BFG. Your story is apparently quite true. Summon the head of the army and the head of the Air Force immediately. And that is the end of that chapter. Next chapter is called The Plan, and I will read that one in a couple days.